Do you believe in God? Do you believe there's a creator? Do you believe there's someone that created everything that we observe and see and what we're experiencing in this life? Or are you on the side of the fence where you'd say, no, there's no creator. This whole thing just evolved out of nothing into what we know today. So many people today have gone down the pathway of atheism. Here in the United States of America, we're currently at a place where 81% of the people believe there's a creator, but 19% say there is no creator. They're what we call atheist. They don't believe that God exists. And that's an interesting stat because for me growing up a number of decades ago, it was not the case. It was definitely a case where people were much more in a position in their hearts and minds that they believed that there was a creator, that there is a creator. But we see a lot of things trending downward, and that trend in America is increasing. It's going downward in the sense that less and less people are believing in a creator. What about you? Do you believe in the creator? My name is Paul Morrison. We're here at the XYZ Biblecast, and I'm representing Gen X. And in our generation growing up, almost everyone in America seemed to believe in God, and the idea that believing in God was so, say they didn't believe in God was so foreign, it's so weird that people would think that. What about you guys? Introduce yourselves, please, gentlemen, and tell us about things in your generation and in your nation.
Hey, my name is Taj. I am here in Jamaica representing Gen Y, the millennials, and here for the most part, I would say very few. I would say if I'm going to guess, under 10%, maybe even 5% or lower of people that would actually identify as atheists. Generally speaking, the vast majority of people that you're going to run into are going to say they believe in some sort of creator. Now, where that conversation goes is another discussion in itself, but very few people would actually identify as atheists by far here in Jamaica.
Yeah, and I am Bandile Dlamini, representing Gen Z in Eswatini, Africa. So in my generation, growing up at least, it was very rare for you to come across someone who didn't believe in God. And I think it's still the case today as well when we go around evangelizing. It's still very rare, even though I can say that now there is a little bit of an uptick in people who don't believe in God or people who would identify as atheists. But I believe that is because of social media, mostly because some of the people that I've met in Swaziland that claim to be atheists are not really atheists. They're agnostic at best. But I would say over 90%, I think I can comfortably say over 90% of Eswatini believes there is a God.
That sounds what America used to be like, where well over 90% would say, yeah, there's definitely a creator, because it's intuitive. And that's one of the things that I like about the Bible. We like to use this term, a first truth. A first truth is something that doesn't need to be taught. It's just, we just know this to be the case. And I think what's caught my generation by surprise, and maybe even those older than me, is to think that there's really people that don't believe in a creator. How do you explain the creation? How do you look outside and see something? How do you look at people and not see, wait a minute, how did this just randomly happen? And I like to even use logic and say, wait a minute, how could, even if there's this theory called the Big Bang that so many people obviously know about, if not everybody, this idea of the Big Bang, that was laughable when I was younger. People like, no, that didn't really happen. It's just a theory. And unfortunately, the theory has become fact in some people's minds when there's absolutely no evidence to back it up. There's speculation. But why would people conclude that? Why do we come to that conclusion? And I think one of the reasons why people want to come to that conclusion is they want to dismiss the accountability before a creator. And so if we can say there's no God, then I'm not accountable to anyone that's of a higher authority and of a supreme being. And I think that's one of the reasons why. But, how do we get there? And, you mentioned, Bandile, how social media, and it goes back to the culture in America through movies, through education material, even a lot of the things in the scientific community, which they say is fact, but is not actually backed up, has led people to believe that there's this thing called evolution. But I like to use logic. And so to me, logically, even if there was a Big Bang, where did the matter come from to create the Big Bang? someone had to create the matter. I mean, that just makes sense to me. So if there's this big bang that created everything that we see and we evolved out of that matter, where did that matter come from in the first place? That's a logical question that I want someone to answer, and no one's ever been able to answer that for me, unless there's a creator who himself was never caused. He's the first cause of everything, himself uncaused. And to me, that the only thing that makes logical sense is there must be an eternal being that had no beginning, who's outside of time, space, and matter, who's not confined by those three things like we are as humans. God is outside of those things. He's not confined by time. He's not confined by space. He's not confined by matter, but he created all three of those. And that's the only thing that makes logical sense. And many people I've talked to in the years that say they believe in evolution, or they say they believe in the Big Bang, they don't want to talk about where the matter came from. And I think that's an excuse. We got to go there. I want to go there. What have you guys have heard? What kind of conversations have you had through the years with people? Or tell me about what you would think as a child. You know, for me as a child, the idea that God existed just seemed so natural and so intuitive that no one had to teach me. Of course, my parents did. Society did. Yes, I went to church, but I think even before I realized that any kind of influence from church, it just seems right. It just seems intuitive.
So for me, I had a very interesting path, if you will. As someone who I would consider, even though I was athletic and I played sports, I always considered myself to be a nerd, and I was into science and researching all this stuff. Bill Nye the Science Guy back in the day and all of these different things. I used to just really feed on this stuff. And one of the biggest stumbling blocks, I guess you would say, of my faith and trying to figure out where God fits into all of this, or how I fit into all of this, and what I need to do in response to this God that created me, was the fact that I had two very different conversations. The conversation that I was having in science class, and that I was having, quote unquote, with the scientific community, if you will. Different words in different communities mean different things. Even when we heard theories, we heard evolution and so forth, it means different things depending who you're speaking to. So I struggled because on one hand, when I would ask a question to a science teacher or a scientist running all these experiments and so forth, I would get answers. But then when I would go to, say, the Christian community and I would ask certain questions, most times it was just dismissed, and it was just sort of like, oh, doubtful Thomas, just to believe. So it was a struggle for me. And unfortunately, I started to copy and cut and paste and believe all these different things, trying to make sense in both worlds, when truthfully it came to the point where I just had to realize that they're incompatible. Either I'm going to believe in the creator, or I'm going to believe that everything just happened by chance. And at this point in time right now, it's actually even something that's on the rise. Like, there is a large number of people that just by mathematical probability have come to the conclusion that there has to be some intelligence behind the information. Therefore, whether or not they believe in a God, or the God of the Bible, and the God that I wholeheartedly believe in, and believe that everything in creation points people towards, that's up for a discussion within those communities. But they'll say just probability says that, you know, all this stuff just randomly happening. It's just illogical to come to that point. So it's just very interesting now that things come full circle, and that conversation is now being had with people that would not promote themselves or introduce themselves as Christians, yet many of the conclusions 100% are supported by the Bible if they would just accept the rest of it. But for other reasons, they don't accept the Bible in those things. But at least they're coming to the conclusion that there is a creator. So I think it's very good. Like, you know, things go in cycles. Solomon says there's nothing old, right? I mean, there's nothing new, and old things have become new. And we're in a position right now where people who would be, you know, the most respected scientists in the world are coming to the conclusion that we that trust in the Bible have already made.
Yeah, on our side in Eswatini, I think what has really helped us out through the years is that there's a culture in Swaziland of going to church on Sunday. I think I might have mentioned this before, but on a Sunday in Eswatini, it's very quiet. If you go to town or you're just driving around, you'll notice that Sundays are very quiet. And most of the time, it's quiet because a lot of people are at church. And I grew up in a family like that where we went to church every Sunday. And that sort of cements the idea in your mind as a child that there is a God. And a lot of people in Swaziland tend to believe that even into their adult years. Those that tend to identify with being atheists are really just people who have, or rather, people who feel like they've been hurt by God in some way. That's what I've noticed from the conversations that I've had with people. And that's why earlier I said that they're not atheists, but in fact, let me take that back. But okay, I'll tell you why shortly. But they're not atheists, but they're agnostic. They are wondering if God exists, because if he did, why would he allow them to go through what they went through? So the reason why I was stumbling over my words shortly is because I believe that's the case for atheists too. Because I've noticed that a lot of real atheists, because when I was staying in Pretoria in South Africa, I have met real atheists in South Africa. And I've noticed that all the atheists that I have met have a Christian background. When I say Christian, I mean just believing in God and Jesus Christ. They have that background, and they also seem to have been hurt somewhere down the line and then have committed their lives to proving that God doesn't exist, to deal with their hurt and trauma.
Yeah, I've met people who have the same thing. They've said the same thing to me. And sometimes you read between the lines. People have been hurt by false religion. People have been hurt by fake Christians. And even if it was a genuine Christian who misportrayed God. I mean, we are humans. There's no Christian that's a perfect representation of Jesus Christ. There's no human being that's a perfect representation of God. And so we do mess up. And we sometimes hurt people in the process, so to speak. And that's sad. It's unfortunate. Hopefully we learn from those mistakes and we grow. But people oftentimes say there is no God because they've been hurt. And that's true. My heart does go out to them. And I hope that they can look past Christians and look past churches and simply look to the heavens and be in touch and be in communication with and seek to know the God who created all of this whole place, and the God who created them, and not let Christians and churches be stumbling blocks to them having a relationship with their Creator. That would be the best thing. I love what the Bible says in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. We talked earlier about the first truth, how a first truth is a truth that doesn't need to be explained. It's just something that we know. And I agree with you, man. I believe deep down that everybody knows there's a God. Everyone deep down within the recesses of their heart, especially when they were younger, they know there's a God. It's intuitive. And so the Bible begins with the first truth. Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And so the Bible begins with this first truth. God doesn't explain who he is. He doesn't explain that he exists. He just states something that we already know to be the case, that in the beginning, God was there. He's an eternal God. He's always existed. And it's good for us to simply admit that, to confess to that. There's an eternal God who loves you, who created you, who wants a relationship with you, but there's an enemy that wants to keep you from that relationship. And so sometimes fake Christians, sometimes even true Christians get in the way of that, or churches get in the way of that, but your Creator is seeking after you.
One of the most interesting things about that is how it is opened up with, like, in the beginning, God, right? Just presented as a matter of factly, no introduction, no explanation. It just is, right? In the beginning, God starts off, then the narrative and the rest of the Bible goes into play. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're at 90+% in Eswatini and here in Jamaica as well, as opposed to in the States, because from kindergarten up, it's just presented as a matter of factly that there is a God. And I think the education system has a very big part of it, because I was educated in the States, then I moved back to Jamaica, and I know what the school system like is there in public school. And God is never presented as a matter of factly. If anything, it's brought up in a negative connotation in social studies class as to why there were so many wars or something of that nature, right? But in Jamaica, and from what I understand and saw from my experience when I did visit Eswatini last year, actually it was this year, was that there is that foundation even in school where there is prayer, there is a little devotion. Now, this isn't forced on anyone. It's completely optional. It's not like anyone's being dragged through the coals, if you will, like some people would have you believe. But that foundation that is being presented as a matter of factly as being a fact that is, here's this story, this fairy tale that you might hear in arts and class, that in art class. It's a very different presentation, and I think is a foundation as to why in Jamaica that the majority of atheists, which by the way, I've only met one that I've had a conversation with, but I hear of them. They go to university and they become atheists. So there's this myth on the island that if you send your child to become a doctor, they're going to become an atheist. And it's because they're presented with all these other counterpoints that if their faith wasn't ever grounded, and these are usually kids that never even figured out their faith to begin with anyways, that when they're presented something differently, they're quick to resent it. And then tying it back into now what we just spoke about with trauma, I think it reminds me of a verse when it comes to 2 Peter 3:5. It says they are willingly ignorant. Now, this might trigger some people and it might upset some people. But I think because of the trauma, whatever it is that they were going through, that passage is all about the days of Noah and all those different things where people reject all the signs and all the evidence that is presented to them. And I think because of their trauma, whatever it was, maybe their father was a preacher or their aunt or their uncle or something happened to them in a church that made them reject religion as a whole. And because of this, they now refuse to believe in a God. And what I've found, those people almost gets to a point of arrogance, and sorry if this is triggering anyone, but it gets to the point where if this particular guy, long story short, I met him at a restaurant. I heard him trying to convince someone that there is no God, and I just said, let's just say all there is to know in the universe, what percentage of it do you think you know? And he was arrogant enough to say 5%. I said, wow, you know a lot. Then I said, well, is there a possibility that God exists in that 95%? And he said, no. So I said, there's 95% of all there is to know in the universe, and you're willing to say that God, there's no chance he could exist in there. Well, to me, that tells me you've made up your mind, and no matter what is presented, you're going to willingly deny God. And at that point, I say, okay, this is a person that chooses to be an atheist. And I think just as Pastor Bandile just said, the reasonable position to be would be an agnostic, someone who would say, it's possible, I don't know. If he's out there, I would love to know. Or if he's out there, I haven't seen that evidence that lets me believe so, but I'm open to the idea. Right? Anyone who goes all the way to say there is no God is drawing a line in the sand and willingly chooses to not observe or take in any other evidence. And I think that the only way to arrive there is through some sort of trauma, from my personal experience.
Yeah, that's true. And it's interesting what you said about the school system, because in Swaziland, I don't know about the countries that you guys are in, but in Swaziland, it's still mandatory that kids take RE, which stands for religious education, where they teach religious education. It's not Christian education, it's religious education. So they actually supposed to teach you about every religion. And from what I remember from school, they kind of do tell you about other religions as well, but it's sort of centered around Christianity. So 90% of the time, they're telling you about God and Jesus Christ and salvation even. Now, whether or not the information is 100% accurate, I wouldn't remember. I'd have to look into that, but they do teach kids. It's still mandatory. What's really cool as well is in Swaziland, a lot of meetings. I think from both of you men being in Swaziland, you'll remember this. A lot of meetings start with an open prayer. Even public government meetings will start with an opening prayer. So that is interesting because it sort of sets the tone for most people in Swaziland. But I'm actually curious if in America and Jamaica, do people still do opening prayers, and do they have RE at school?
In America, we have a number of public events and venues that still begin with prayer. In fact, about 8 years ago, I was invited as a pastor in New York to go to a county legislature meeting and give the opening prayer before that meeting. And I was shocked because if you listen to the media, they make you think that America's rejected God and religion altogether. And even though it's a growing number of atheists in America, is still the strong majority of people do believe in a creator. And I understand over time that'll probably change as the baby boomers die off and as Gen X dies off. I mean, there's a big shift from the boomers to Gen X, and then a greater shift from Gen X to Gen Y, the millennials. And we see an increase in atheism, but we still do practice that. Our founding documents, our founding fathers of this nation believed in a creator. And no matter what religious background they came from, the strong majority believed in the creator. And all of our founding documents reflect that. And so much through the years does reflect that. Even when I went to the public school system in New York in the 1980s into the 1990s, creation was talked about by science teachers. And it was presented more as a theory in equal with the theory of evolution. But even I remember certain science teachers kind of rolling their eyes at the idea of evolution, and you could tell they believed in creation. And you can be, by the way, you can be a legit and completely bona fide scientist and believe in creation, because there is no science that denies creation. There's no science whatsoever. And at the same time, there's no science that proves evolution. When I went to school, I hope it's still the same, science was considered science when it was observable and repeatable. And unless we can change that definition, there is no science to prove evolution. I do believe in adaptation. I do believe you can see species adapt to their environment. Even we see that in humanity. And so I have no problem with that, but I don't believe in macroevolution where one kind of animal becomes another kind of animal. And that doesn't seem possible, doesn't seem logical, and there's no evidence for that. And so I remember very clearly that we would have science. It would present creation. It would also present evolution, and you were to make your own decision, just as people still do today. But to answer your question, Bandile, yes, there still are many public events that begin with it. As far as religious education in the public school, no, that's no more. That left in the 1960s. And including prayer. They removed prayer from the public school. They removed the Bible. In fact, the Bible used to be the main English textbook of public schools up until a certain point in the 20th century. And so we departed from that. And here we are. So, yeah, it has changed a lot. Let's take a look at a verse. I want to kind of bring this podcast to a close, and I'll show you something here in Psalm 19, and you guys can comment on it as well. And then I think in future podcasts we'll do some more on this topic. But look at Psalm 19, verse 1, where it says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard." And so it's referring to the witness of creation. How every day, no matter where you are in this world, no matter what language you speak, the heavens declare God's glory. The firmament, that's the world in which we live. It shows his handiwork, what the Creator has made. And so anybody, no matter what language they speak, no matter what generation they were born into, no matter what their religious experiences are, no matter what whether they've been burnt by Christians or by churches, every human being has the opportunity, and it's presented before them every day, day unto day, night unto night. It's constantly there the proof, the evidence that we can observe there's a creator. How do you know there's a creator? You see the creation. It's just like if I was to show you a painting, you would say, oh, there must have been a painter that didn't just evolve on its own. I could pull out my cell phone and say, hey, this is my phone. And would you say that just evolved? It just came to be, that the components just happened to assemble themselves together and they developed over time? Or would you say, no, that's ridiculous. It had a designer and a manufacturer, and that's absolutely true. In fact, you think of the idea of a cell phone, and it's developed so much in my lifetime. I remember in high school, a brick. My buddy had a brick. It was literally the size of a brick and weighed about the weight of a brick. And it cost $2 a minute back in the 1991. It was $2 a minute. And you better make sure that's an emergency call, because no one would pay that kind of money back then for a phone call. And we've seen phones develop to where they are now, where they're better than my computer back in the day. And you would say, if I was to line up all of these cell phones from 1992 to today, you would say, oh, wow, the phone has evolved. And you're right, if you use that definition in that way, but each phone has a designer and a manufacturer. It didn't just happen on its own, that this just morphed, take the iPhone series. It didn't go from 1 to 2 on its own. It didn't go to 2 to 3 on its own. Each time there was intelligent design that developed and produced a better product each time. And in the creation, we see that God built various animals. He designed them. He manufactured them. They're all unique and individual and on purpose. And yes, he built within it some adaptation, but he still built and designed animals after their kind. And then he built man. He designed humanity. And it just shows that God is an amazing designer. You and I are living proof. You are living proof that there's a creator, because you're something created, someone created. And you've been intelligently designed. I encourage you all to read Psalm 139. I was reading that this morning, in fact, how we are fearfully and wonderfully made. God made us on purpose with specific design and for a specific reason. And that's exciting to me. My Creator designed me for a reason. He designed you for a reason. And God has a plan and purpose for all of us. Read Psalm 139 and you'll be blessed.
And I agree with that. I think understanding and believing that concept is a blessing, right? I think when you look at places where people genuinely do not believe that they were fearfully and wonderfully made by a creator, they have no purpose. And I think there's like a huge correlation with people that are going through depression and all these different things because they don't have a sense of purpose. And we see that with a lot of young people that are joining all sorts of organizations and fighting fights that they have no business fighting because they want they want a sense of purpose, right? And I believe that's one of the benefits of believing in God. I mean, there's multiple. I can go on and on and on and on, obviously. But I think one of the first things to go when you think that you're not fearfully and wonderfully made by a creator is that you have no purpose. And that leads society into a very dangerous place. And we've seen that through history where different societies start to go off the haywire. And one of the things that usually goes within those societies is that they think they have no purpose to serve a God, and then they end up serving crazy dictators or whatever it might be. And that's a scary place to be. So I think this generation and further future generations would be in a much better place if you just trust and believe that you have a purpose for being here.
Yeah, and in fact, this is something we had a conversation about recently. But in Acts 17, there's a verse that talks about how for a specific time God winked at ignorance, but now He commands all men everywhere to repent. And verses like Psalm 119 just remind me of the fact that everyone has that responsibility to repent, not only just believe that there is a supernatural being out there, because you see the heavens and the firmament and all of God's handiwork. You know, when you just observe nature, that there must be a God out there. And therefore you must repent because you are accountable to that God. And I have people ask me this question a lot, that, oh, but what about those people who live in remote places where there's no electricity and or anything, and they've definitely not heard about Jesus Christ or even have access to a Bible? Usually when I come across people that ask me that question, I say, well, you know what? You have a Bible, so you worry about, you know, your own salvation, and let God worry about all those other people who are hypothetically in these remote areas. But even for a person in that remote location, they are able to come to the conclusion that there is a God just by observing nature and all of God's handiwork. So it's really, it seems, as Pastor Morrison said, it's a first truth because it's a logical truth. And people who are atheists like to make fun of Christians and make it seem like you are believing something stupid. But you know what? It takes faith for you to believe in God, but it also takes faith for you to believe in the Big Bang Theory and evolution. Because as Pastor Morrison said, it's not observable and repeatable. So, yeah. I think that it is a blessing to see verses like this in the Bible that remind us that we can all come to the logical conclusion that there is a God.
And that's why the Bible says the heavens declare. The heavens declare the glory of God. He has given us all the observable proof that we need to draw a conclusion in our minds and in our hearts that there is a creator. And if there is, which we know there is, I better find out who he is. I better get to know who he is, because I should want to know who he is. We should want to know our creator. We should want to have a relationship with the God that made me. That's exciting to me, to know that God created me for a purpose and I should know him. And here's the conclusion that I've come to when having this conversation when people say there is no creator. Either we're going to believe in eternal God or we'll believe in eternal matter. Something has always had to exist. And to me, it's beyond faith to believe in eternal matter. It's not logical that atoms and matter always existed. Well, then who created the space in which that matter has come to pass or always existed? And who created time? And it just doesn't make sense. The only logical conclusion that we can come to is that there's a creator who himself had no beginning. He is the first cause, himself uncaused. He is the one that created time, space, and matter simultaneously. In fact, the Bible says this: in the beginning, there's a time. God, there's the eternal creator, created the heaven, there's the space, and the earth, there's the matter. God created time, space, and matter. And Genesis 1:1 says it so well. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. There it is. It makes sense. And if you're listening today and you're on the fence on this, you maybe you grew up in a Christian culture, you grew up in a Christian household, maybe you grew up in church, and for some reason you've departed from that. Maybe you've been hurt, you've been burned, and you're on the fence. You hear what they're saying in Hollywood, you hear what they're saying in social media, and you want to, your heart's being torn as to what you really believe. Just go outside tonight. Take a look at the creation. Look to your creator. You'll see the answer. It's right there. There's a creator that loves you, that wants to heal your hurts. Don't look to man. Look to God. He's the answer. May the Lord bless you. Thank you for joining us for this podcast. We're here on the XYZ Biblecast. If you have a question or comment, please feel free to leave one in the comment section below, and we'd appreciate hearing from you. May the Lord bless you. We'll see you next time.